OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again, II.1, an address. And we thought we might go through the introduction some. I also see that Theory Underground will be having at 1 today a conversation with the great Studebaker. So everyone should check that out with Dave and Nance and Cadell. And I find it very inspiring as well what they are doing with live events in Europe. And I think that's a tremendous undertaking for this liminal web space to feed the online and the real together. So I think that's tremendous work that's being done with Cadell and Theory Underground, and I'm very, very happy to see that they will be speaking and seeing Studebaker. He's wonderful. He gave a tremendous lecture on Plato and the beautiful and the good and the gathering. I really enjoyed. So we're going to be talking about belonging again, II.1, and we're going to be reading from the introduction. You can find this on Amazon. You can find some conversations on Instagram. There's also going to be audio summaries that will be uploaded on YouTube. We also recently put up the table of contents, which you can find with a video playlist for some of the pieces over the years, Substack, Medium, so the table of contents can be found there. And you will also find a conversation on belonging again, II.1, that could be found on Cadell's channel. And all thoughts, all reviews, all questions are appreciated. As I am reading today, if anyone has any questions in the chat, please go right ahead. I can't promise I'll get to everything, but I will do my best. So we will do this for a little bit. So this is part 2, following from part 1, which was called an explanation, and this is called an address. And the explanation has a lot to do with the work of Philip Rieff, Peter Berger, various sociologists that tell us that we live in an age where we no longer have givens. And Rieff uses the language of constraints, but I think givens are quite useful because really, say if we believe in Christianity or Islam or secular, atheism or different things like that, it's not really a belief that we experience. We don't experience it so tentatively. It's more axiomatic, if you will. It's more given. It's just given that the universe is created by God. It's just given that the universe isn't created by God. It's not something you think about. And what a lot of them warned is that when human beings become aware that their beliefs are tentative, that they're not necessarily something given, they can become existentially overwhelmed. And when they are so existentially overwhelmed, they can react poorly. They can turn to strong men. They can turn against people different from them. There's all sorts of trouble. But you see, givens were also the things that made possible, say, the banality of evil. They made possible oppression, closed-mindedness. So if you go back to givens, there's a certain regression in that. So it's not so simple. And if indeed the loss of givens is strongly tied with the meaning crisis or the meta crisis or all these different sociological conditions that are a bit pathological, we actually should see a kind of hope in that there's an opportunity for a negation sublation that we should take seriously. And the address will be kind of expanding on what that could look like and what that might actually mean. But it's tricky because you have the great and lurking problem of scale. Any good ideas we have may actually be oppressive at a certain scale that forces everyone to conform to them. So that's a big problem. And then the other issue is we have to take very seriously that the world is probably the way that the world is because of good ideas, not because a bunch of dumb people came up with stupid stuff or evil people came up with evil stuff or whatever. It was probably a result of good ideas. And so that's also very tricky because that would also suggest that if we're going to do something different or have a new idea of what the subject might look like, we have to be quite skeptical of our good ideas because what we think is a good idea, well, they in the past probably thought it was a good idea. So we have to be careful. We have to take a path that likely is going to seem like a good idea to walk, even if there are times when it is not, or there might be booby traps, if you will, that we don't realize are there. So these all have to be kept in mind. And the belonging again, too, can be looked at as a kind of sociological address, a social theory that is supposed to correlate or parallel the truism, the rational trilogy that starts with the conflict of mind, then the map is indestructible, and then ends with reconstructing A is A. And this will also integrate thinking from some of the thoughts book, first thoughts, second thoughts, and the fate of beauty is also quite important. And these things you could check out for more information. The recent Alex Ebert conversation, we talked on a lot, the conversation on Thomas Jochen, we had net sessions. 95 on freeing speech, I suggest 96. They've all been lovely. 94. I think it's 41 also gets a lot into various metaphysical schema. But today we're going to be reading again the introduction of Belonging Again II.1. And you can find the book on Amazon. And again, you can find a table of content on Substack and Medium. It opens with a bit of a poem from a wonderful poet, Milslos. This is called Encounter. Oh, my love, where are they? Where are they going? The flash of a hand, streak of movement, rustle of pebbles. I ask not out of sorrow, but in wonder. One of part 2, Coming to Terms with Childhood. Introduction, addressing the explanation. If we're not going to seclude ourselves or engage in some exodus, we must find a way to achieve rest and belonging around others who are very different from us, and this is not natural, suggesting we will have to become supernatural or something, somehow. Belonging Again, part 1, explored possibilities like science, psychoanalysis, college activism, religion, and so on. And though I by no means want to claim that I exhausted all possibilities and angles, I hope to have at least shown that there are no easy roads left. Without a transcendent God or a capital X variable, which is described in part 1, it would seem our best hope for belonging again is isolationist. Hence why we cannot readily claim some nations are irrational to have atomized so much, nor assume that an exodus strategy is bad. Furthermore, say a benedict option or things like that. Furthermore, there is wisdom in a Buddhist meditation and practice through which we transcend the question of belonging entirely, as there is wisdom in a benedict option that seeks limited interaction with society, which also brings to mind Ivan Illich, though what constitutes too limited or overly limited might be difficult to determine. However, part 1 suggested this could be to give up on pluralistic modern society, which ultimately might be what we must do, though this book explores ways we might maintain society today and forgo atomization. Basically, the question is if it might be possible for the majority to become Nietzschean children and/or absolute knowers through the creation of a socioeconomic system or field that increases the probability children emerge. If part 2 fails, we might have to concede to something more isolationist. So please note, we're not necessarily saying more isolationist strategies are wrong or bad. We have to go through the work and determine that. As we've learned from Reef, Hunter, and Berger, society needs both therapeutic releases and restraints. Yes and no. And generally speaking, conservatives have defended restraints more than releases, while liberals have defended releases more than restraints. Since both are needed, society emerges in a dialectic between the two, which, if we're intellectually consistent and epistemologically responsible, we easily won't like or want. For society to exist in the space between yes and no is for society to be paradoxical, contradictory, and/or unstable. And this indeed is where society must exist. Naturally, we will want to stabilize society, and so we'll probably and rationally conclude, if we're conservative, that there needs to be more restraint, while if we're liberal, we'll conclude there needs to be more release. Driven by rationality and a desire for existential stability, AA, those on the right and left will exist in a tension, out of which society will form. This has always been the case, long before our secular age, but thanks to pluralism, tension has grown. Society has always been unstable, but the instability and Godel-esque incompleteness was more hidden by X-backed community, character, ethics, and givens, keeping that instability from overwhelming us. But times have changed. And we are referencing here ideas and notions from part 1, and the X-backed is a capital X variable, speaking on, say, James Hunter, The Death of Character, all of these different texts on the difficulty of having an authoritative ground or basis of one's character formation, subjectivity, and worldview without something transcendent. But of course, the moment you introduce something transcendent, there are various pathologies and possibilities of power that otherwise would not be possible. Cadell last has reflected with phenomenology of spirit on how, in Hegel, there is a growing feeling of increasing contingency, of a need to accept otherness, A-B-ness over A-A-ness, to use language from The True Isn't the Rational, which is to say that increasingly more people need to make an absolute choice. The role of otherness is most clear and profound in the layer of religion in Hegel. And though there is little debate on the necessary role of all the stages before religion, today people may feel that the religious level can be replaced with something new, rather communism, making America great, transhumanism, and so on. And furthermore, they can feel like it must be replaced, suffering the anxiety and tension of encountering others who believe they need to save the world from them. Where givens fail, hard choices must be made. I would highly suggest the Phenomenology of Spirit playlist that you can find on Cadell's website, Philosophy Portal. He talks a lot about the phenomenological journey as a way to understand the movements in the phenomenology of spirit, and I find that an incredibly useful framing and an incredible playlist. So I would highly suggest that, and I would highly suggest also purchasing the classes that you can find on philosophyportal.com. There's one on the phenomenology of spirit, Nietzsche, the science of logic was extraordinary, and then Lacan in the philosophy of right class is coming soon, and I think quite highly of the philosophy of right. So I would suggest signing up today for those classes. Cadell notes the concerns of Dr. Thomas Hammelrick, a scholar and expert on René Girard, who suggests, given that we learn from Girard, that we should be very careful to replace religion, considering the power of religion to make social orders possible, and also because it tends to be the case that people who seek to replace religion may also seek something that builds and empowers the ego in problematic ways. And please note, when we mention religion here, we have a capital R signifying Hegel. And also Dr. Hammelrick has some lovely presentations on Girard that can be found at Parallax. If we cannot handle this challenge, it would perhaps be better not to replace religion at all. But then, as Belonging again has argued, religion has already been deconstructed and a choice already made. We cannot go back. The question is only if we can negate sublate religion or generate a new religion, which means us in our current state, world, and predicament. It is possible that most people cannot handle absolute knowing, which is to say they cannot integrate with otherness, which I associate with the movement, notably to reason from self-consciousness and the phenomenology of spirit. We had a presentation called The Absolute Choice. You can find all the conferences that we did at philosophyportal.com. I suggest that. And yet that would seem to resume, and yet that would seem to be necessary now that religion has been deconstructed. Following Girard, this means we are at risk of falling back into cycles of mimetic desire and scapegoating, for religion helps stop those cycles of violence. No, religion didn't always prove so useful and even contributed to violence. But the point is that the removal of religion is not something to be undergone lightly. And yet we seem to have stumbled into the act with little thought. Now, the cracks and breaks in religion are so visible and undeniable that it is questionable if it can still function, and if it ever did function, to help people gain absolute knowing. At which point a new philosophy and new metaphysics seem necessary, either to replace religion or to mend religion, where it has proved cracking and breaking. Regardless, though, I see no way to heal or replace religion without absolute knowing and childhood, which is to say there must be a growth of absolute knowers, delusive individuals, and or the like. This can open up discussions on the Helgenization of Nietzsche, the role of intrinsic motivation, the need for a return to common life, which is referencing Hume, and so on. And for more on the great David Hume, please check out Samuel Barnes's book, The Iconoclast, the great Donald Livingston's book on philosophical melancholia. There's a paper in The Conflict of Mind called Deconstructing Common Life, what Hume means by that, what Hume, the great David Hume, means by that. Pluralism in our secular age causes existential instability in numerous ways, which cannot be reversed. And restless, we must live in a world where authoritarianism will have appeal. Importantly, the more pluralistic and secular the world becomes, so too the more appealing will be authoritarianism. And seeing as the trends of pluralism and secularism cannot be reversed, so neither can we reverse the growing appeal of totalitarianism. Can we make it unappealing for the majority, thus keeping the beast at bay? Perhaps, but that will require us to reverse a lot of bad habits. For too long, we have viewed the tensions and instabilities of the world as a problem that could be solved versus an inherent condition of society, which pluralism and secularism haven't so much created as they have intensified. We have ignored Hegel's science of logic. Viewing the tensions of pluralism as accidental versus essential, we have often blamed the tensions on those who don't think like us, and concluded that removing those others was the key to saving our world. This has only worsened the tensions, which has ironically made us surer that the other must be removed. Our brains certainly don't help. The brain hates instability. And arguably, we think to give ourselves existential and psychological stability more so than to know the truth, as evident by studies on confirmation, the backfire effect, and the like. To accept inherent and essential instability would be to accept what we seem biologically dispositioned not to accept, but which pluralism and secularism have made increasingly undeniable. If this is the case, it is unlikely the majority will accept it without remarkable effort that might be doomed. To be human is to be organic and unpredictable. And in the secular age, there is a real sense in which we are less human. Where there's a lack of rest, there is a lack of humanity. And so why there is legitimacy to the concerns of, say, an Alexander Dugin. We have lost community and the conditions in which a Bonhoeffer would be possible. And though this may mean we have lost the possibility for Hitler, I'm not so sure that this is the case. The tragic trade-off does not seem sufficient, simply because it doesn't seem, as I've spoken to Owen and the Agnon about, despite the claims of Francis Fukuyama, as if the bourgeoisie virtues can replace our need for thymos. This will be explained later, but ultimately this trade-off still might be what we must settle on if we cannot figure out how to spread childhood. The other option is that we somehow take up detachment and transcend the question of belonging altogether. But this, I think, would come at the cost of the socioeconomic order, technology, and rhetoric. It might save us from affliction, but we will not necessarily generate attention, which is a reference to Simone Weil. A manifestation of the continuous legacy of toleration described by A.J. Conyers. Cosmopolitanism today lessens the authority and meaning of local communities, primarily through inflation, which is referencing Charles Taylor in The Secular Age, and moves identity and communal identification up a larger scale from the local to the national and even the global, potentially making these identities increasingly abstract and alienating. And I should note, A.J. Conyers wrote a tremendous book, The Long Truce. The Listening Heart is another text he wrote, and you can, in the Belonging Again, Part 1, discuss them, but I suggest both of those texts. They're quite interesting. In this environment, to resume, it would seem that the banality of evil is too bad to happen, for the state is too big to fail. But with this perhaps positive development, the likelihood for character to manifest is lessened, if not gone. Is this the best we can hope for? That was suggested in Part 1, but then it was also suggested that this option will not ultimately hold. Our need for thymos is too great and cannot be removed. Furthermore, no matter the successes of eros, wealth, the bourgeoisie virtues, and so on, to allude to A is A by O.G. Rose, the brain always tries to make everything an A equals A, in a world where everything we are toward is A. Actually, and this is a formula, so forgive me, A is an A in parentheses is, A is an A in parentheses without B, ergo AB, and that's elaborated on in the paper, A is A, which you can find in on Medium and Substack and so on. To resume, we naturally attempt what we cannot accomplish, eventually destabilizing us, which we can only address through numbness, totalitarianism, or thymos. It is this last option we will consider, for thymos and spreading childhood are connected. And on the topic of thymos, I'm saying it wrong, thymos, Aspasia got me straight. Raymond, or Owen in the Agnon, has a wonderful book, Studies in Thymos, and he also did a great text on Notes from the Pod, and I love the play on Dostoevsky there. So the great Raymond, Owen, I suggest his work a lot. He has some of the most tremendous elucidations of the work of, say, Fukuyama. He's been doing on the movement of civilization. Just a great individual, great mind. Highly suggest his work. Modern philosophy determined an objective and non-conditional ground for thought was impossible, and it is not by chance that pluralism arose alongside modern philosophy. Does this mean we were in the wrong to ever have givens at all? History is not so simple, as we learned from Hegel, for we had to have givens to get started. If we were never thrown into anything, history would have never started, and there are certain beliefs that we must follow to arrive at a place where we can advance, even though from that new place we might look back and realize our steps were errors, which Hegel teaches us not to fear. For most of history, we have lived where making explicit the implicit background of society destroyed it. Now we must be the kind of people who can make the implicit explicit and not ruin it, like handling a spider web with our bare hands, which is an allusion to that great Wittgenstein quote. There's a sense in which givens were training wheels in the process of becoming human, and now we must belong in what actually constitutes the human becoming. This is ultimately paradoxical and lack as either an effect of a apophatic excess or an ultimate nothingness, either of which bring negativity, for we can feel judged and inadequate in the presence of greatness, which means we must find belonging and lacking, which is for us to be at home in a home that becomes, with the be in parentheses, to signify the way that Hegel means it at the end of The Doctrine of Being, Science of Logic. And Alex Ebert has a tremendous paper on that in Into the Alien, an anthology out of Philosophy Portal, I suggest. All of this requires conceptual mediation, everything that we said. As an aside, and this point must be elaborated on later, especially when we focus on lack with the Lithuanian Free Market Institute, and as I discussed with Guy Senstock, perhaps in 2.2, but it could be 2.20, who knows. And there are O.G. Rose conversations with the Lithuanian Free Market Institute about lack, and the Guy Senstock discussions can be found on his tremendous channel. He does wonderful work in circling. Please note that to speak of an essential lack is not necessarily to speak of an essential nothingness, for lack is not nothing. As stressed throughout O.G. Rose, notably A Philosophy of Glimpses, and also stressed by the work of the great Thomas Jonkin. To channel Alex Ebert's work, this is for lack could be a product of us confronting a finitude of ourselves that is limited and so incapable of containing everything which is in excess of it, and hence it lacks. All of this is what I have in mind when I speak of the apophatic and or a river hole, which will come up when we discuss Systems and Subjects by Cadell Lass. Tremendous book that you should pick up. This is a point of clarification I will not always make, so please keep in mind as we move forward. The tyranny of language. There is a debate being had between dialectical materialism and new materialism, which we might frame as a debate between Zizek, Hegel, Lacan, and Deleuze, and the precise way that lack is part of reality as either an apophatic excess or an ultimate nothingness is under consideration. I myself believe there are ways to think Deleuze and Hegel together, which will be a main concern of the Absolute Choice, which is a book, but I also acknowledge that a danger of Deleuze and emphasizing creative positivity is that we do not do the work of facing negativity and the real as stressed by Lacan. This strikes me as a grave mistake, and yet at the same time, I think we can associate children with Deleuzian individuals. There seems to be a cheap Deleuzianism and a costly Deleuzianism, to allude to Bonhoeffer. And that's a play on his book, The Cost of Discipleship, where he talks about cheap grace, which is the grace where you do whatever you want and then afterwards pray for forgiveness, and the costly grace that has you take up your cross. So it's an allusion to Bonhoeffer. And without Lacan, the good of Deleuze seems to become pathological and problematic. At the same time, there also seems to be trouble if we take the negativity of Lacan and suggest it as part of the core of reality itself in an unapophatic fashion. Not that Lacan himself ever did this, and there's that big book, that great book by Lorenzo Ciccár that Andrew, they talk about it, The Vanishing Mediator, the not to, and he stresses in that text how with Nick, Nick and they do wonderful work, great individuals. And they're hilarious comedy videos. You have to see those. But they stress in the book Not To how we have to be careful to ontologize Lacan. So we're just noting that in the Not To by Lorenzo. That's a tremendous book. How do we avoid either of these mistakes? Indeed, that question will be a great concern of us throughout O.G. Rose, a problem which I think Alex Ebert can help us with later on. And I just had a talk with Alex, Mr. Ebert. Anyway, Bruce Alderman of the Integral Stage discusses how our challenge today is creating a socioeconomic foundation for interdisciplinary and shadow work, as we'll discuss with Ivan Illich. And he stresses that true diversity requires us to accommodate difference without destruction. Gödel similarly notes that an absolute knower and child cannot fit into any integrated whole, but instead learns to integrate with the lack of the whole and form networks with others who do the same. As Gödel puts it, not fitting elements can form networks that overlap in synergistic temporalities that are too complex for any integrated model, but are nevertheless a type of conceptual integration that is impossible to represent, which is more like a milieu in the sense discussed by David McCarricker at Theory Underground, who again will be starting a conversation with the great Benjamin Studebaker soon with Gödel and Nance at 1 today. We might also consider Deleuze and the essential difference which belongs together as another form of belonging in not belonging. In one way, this is a tough development, but in another way, it means we have approached truth. For a main hope of part 1 was to show, with the conflict of society, that societies are fundamentally incomplete, in line with Kurt Gödel's thinking, a move which will, in this book, extend to other fields, like economics. And I think if you want to listen to that, the conflict of society and the value circle, and the value circle is inspired by Missing Axioms by Samuel Barnes, you can find that, I think it's 34 or 35, on the playlist about belonging in part 1. Givens hid this reality and were never actually substantive, only seemed such. Their deconstruction was more like the vanishing of a mirage, vanishing mediators. We were always in need of absolute milieus, but Givens helped us avoid that truth. No longer. Philosophy is what follows from true pluralism, or so is the argument of O.G. Rose. In light of Hume and Hegel, philosophy leads to absolute skepticism and absolute knowing, which is the realization of ultimate groundlessness, which we then have to learn to live with and experience positively. For sociologists like Hunter and Reif, the thinking of Hume and Hegel was becoming more of a sociological reality, and yet there is a lack of the skills needed to handle that reality, namely philosophy itself. Where we fail to learn to live with groundlessness, this might be when we are most tempted to love artificial intelligence as like humans versus love AI as AI. To make one example of something which might transpire if we don't think groundlessness well and master its art form. If we actually loved AI, that would be one thing. But it is very hard for us to love and not in the act of loving make the other like us. Love is possible because of difference, but love also works to erase that difference. This is a paradoxical tension we have to live with. And if we lose this tension with AI because we deny we love it, pathologies will easily develop. True history will cease. If there is no possibility of an ultimate ground as traditionally understood, then this would also mean there is no possibility of belonging as traditionally understood, which is to say there is a real sense where being a child is to learn to find belonging in not belonging, to instead find belonging in a negation sublation of belonging. Gödel last wrote a tremendous review of Belonging Again Part 1, and in it he asked if we might see the dizzying complexity of our moment as something inherently masterful and beautiful, versus try to become all-knowing masters as an unconscious response. We are to know our limits while also being open to the indeterminable, absolute knowers and children, which means we must find belonging in the place where we risk heartbreak. Gödel worded the central concern of Part 1 when he wrote, "What belonging again invites us to think is what it would take to reestablish Givens without recoiling back to traditional fundamentalisms. That is precisely what we should be trying to think if we want to consider ourselves worthy of the title intellectual." I agree, and what this suggests is what Gödel wrote, that we must never use philosophy to avoid the burden and pain of thought. Indeed, without the burden and pain of thought, which brings one to the contradiction of one's identity, is one even thinking at all? And that's Gödel. No, and failure to think this way, as we will explore, is for us to fall into We's affliction, AA, and prove neurotypical, unable to move beyond rational impasses. As such, we will not be able to think through belonging in a world of artificial intelligence, unregulated global capital, bioengineering, and cultural pluralism, to borrow again from Gödel. And rational impasses is a phrase in reference to a conversation I had with Lorenzo. I think it's O.G. Rose, episode 10. He also has a tremendous TED Talk on collective consciousness, neurodiversity, and game theory dynamics. So I highly suggest Lorenzo's work. Moreover, how are we to think through these dimensions when the large majority of individuals are not formally trained in the foundational philosophical thinkers that may help us raise our minds to the intensities and complexities of the present moment? Indeed, Cadell has put his finger on the problem, which also suggests the problem of scale, which is, I think, a major problem, the problem, you could even say. Despite the impossibility of an ultimate ground, adding to our problem, politicians constantly discuss the need for a common ground. This doesn't exist, especially not without givens. And if it doesn't, that means power is involved, because it necessitates common assumptions about the nature of reality, which someone must have posited, suggesting an imbalance of power. Where there is a ground, there must be a big other, and that means the common ground can serve to protect and empower those already in power. Well, where does that leave us? Conflict? No, it means we must seek a common paradox. Paradox is often conflated with logical contradiction, but these are not the same. Paradox is the strange reality that we understand cats with ideas that cats aren't. How does that work? We are surrounded by paradoxes, which are phenomenologically there, far from abstractions that have nothing to do with reality. We encounter paradoxes all the time. And paradoxes, being so common, can function as a universal experience, like death, sex, and birth have in religious identities and communities, but only if we can handle new menti-divergent epistemologies in which paradoxes and are provided space, AB. This will not come naturally, and it will require us to respect and accept non-rationality, a new challenge. Ever since the Enlightenment, we have generally sought epistemologies which center on Aristotle's formulation of identity and logic as A equals A. This is a very useful model, but it comes up short for helping us navigate difference, especially if things are other, as argued in Hegel's Science of Logic. Things are becoming other, and this being the case, we must think more along A equals B or A/B to suggest a dialectic more than sameness. This is paradoxical, and around it, an entirely different epistemology must be developed. What is this epistemology? Hopefully, it is in the work of O.G. Rose, but a big thrust of it is tearing down dichotomies between certainty and uncertainty. Conflations like of the true and the rational, those tend to be conflated, which is a major problem, and so on. Lots of matters must be addressed, but the point is that a common paradox will require a new epistemology to think and handle. For indeed, thinking AB, attention, rhetoric, is existentially destabilizing, while AA, affliction discourse, stabilizes. And to this example, in passing over, Hunter Coates, in his book about conspiracy with Lacan, notes that if I ask you what is a tree, you instantaneously have to describe roots and limbs and color. And notice from tree, you have to pass over into the thought parts, just like that. And often A is A logic just says, that's a tree. The issue is it's void. There's a way that Hegel describes this in the Science of Logic as it's kind of empty. Tree doesn't tell you anything. If you want tree to tell you something, you have to pass over. Well, if you're passing over from tree to limbs to leaves to define tree as tree, then A is a useful map. I mean, it's useful, but it leans out. It's a null concept. It's empty. Now, that very emptiness could be a kind of principle, a kind of something one could orbit to think new thoughts and develop the subject differently. It just depends on what we mean. But there's something about A as A that's always passing over into otherness. Now that otherness then passes over into a new A as A. Leaf. What is a leaf, right? Trees have leaves and limbs. Well, each one of those is an A and A, so it's all swinging. And I think this is where Alex Ebert's freak theory is so useful in helping describe the ontology of Hegel, the metaphysics, etc. And freak theory, I highly suggest. To resume, paradox is a reason why we need philosophy. If paradoxes didn't exist, science would be enough. But the world is not something that can be understood simply with A as A, because the world is indeed more AB, and that means paradox, or what in Hegel is called contradiction. Contradiction, sometimes confusingly, admittedly, is part of being, and the experience of paradox can actually be a source of wonder. And on Hegel and contradiction, Todd McGowan's incredible books should be checked out. We learn from classic philosophers that philosophy starts in wonder, and in that way, we can say that a common paradox can be a common source of wonder. This could unify difference without secretly hiding a big other, but gaining this will require us dying to our AA and conditioning ourselves to handle anxiety. Can we? If not, then we might continue to assert the need for a common ground and continue to make little progress. We will not become children. We will not leave Plato's cave on our own, for that allegory is fundamentally the description of a paradox. How do we leave on our own from somewhere in which the idea of there being an elsewhere seems impossible? That is a hard question, but we cannot even begin to approach it as a society until we all share the same Mediterranean of lack. This requires much. The deconstruction of beastocentrism, the absolute choice which identifies with otherness, the return to common life of Hume, a new milieu like the cipher, hip-hop cipher, and this is required at scale. Is this a historic period in which a global milieu is needed? Is such a thing possible? Is it a logical contradiction or only a paradox? We must try to find out. Belonging Again, Part 1, made the point that meaning and belonging are not necessarily identical, and that today it requires notable effort to assure they overlap. Again, we must be children, and if we don't realize that gaining meaning will not necessarily be the same as gaining belonging, in fact, it could make our situation worse, then we will perhaps not address our situation, all while we think we address it for good. More than just a metaphysical meaning, we must develop skills, discernment, and commit to something. On the topic of skill, much today depends on our capacity to learn to live with and maintain an unstable situation, which pluralism and secularism have made all the more unstable. It is very possible that our hunger to belong again may contribute to our failure to accept this instability. And rather than try to learn how to maintain it, we may focus our energies elsewhere, contributing to the breakdown of society and or rise of authoritarianism. We may even deny a need for belonging as outdated. And in a way, this is valid. For traditional sources of belonging were arguably not even really belonging, but they function through givens, which ignored the fundamental incompleteness of society. However, if we feel off, uncertain, like we don't know where we should be or where we should go, all of these suggest a lack of belonging, which is a lack of a sense of to what we should commit and arrange the work and blood of our lives, as Part 1 ended discussing. But what does it mean to commit to something in a world where everything is in flux? What does it mean to commit to something unstable? It means we are doing the real work of belonging available to us today in a deep and actual sense that before was not really possible. To ask about belonging is also to ask about economic sustainability and social recognition, as McCarricker often discusses, not for the sake of the ego, but for the sake of not feeling like we're doing something foolish or deviant, as Ivan Illich will discuss. Many liminal web groups often discuss the difficulty of economic sustainability. And basically, the point is that to talk about belonging is also to discuss how such enterprises might prove important in generating rhetoric, freeing speech, drive, menti-divergence, and other topics we'll explore. And Layman Pascal has a wonderful piece on the Metamodern Bureau, I think is what he called it on Substack, getting into these economic dilemmas. So it goes with children in general. How might they belong in our world today versus live on the outskirts? For that, in some respects, it can be good to live on the outskirts, for that can help children avoid delusion and capture by, say, the logic of capital. But this can only prove good to the degree it is sustainable and enabled to flourish. How might incubators of childhood come to have a recognized place in our world, which is to ask how those who engage in the work of childhood might feel like they belong again, to regain what they might feel like they lost as they've aged and worked, but not in a naive or regressive manner. In this way, we are asking a profoundly paradoxical question. How can aliens belong? To allude to Cadell last. How can the outside be considered part of the inside without compromising it, to suggest Alex Ebert's freak theory? Is it impossible? In totality, hopefully, but that incompleteness might be the gift and grace. If we don't, on average, feel like we should be where we are in life, like we shouldn't have been born, like we took a wrong turn, then we don't feel like we belong. Belonging is profoundly tied to motivation and desire. It is not primarily a geographic term. For if we wake up in the morning and want the day ahead, then we can feel like we are exactly where we are supposed to be, that we belong here. But there is a difference between a motivation imposed upon us externally and a motivation cultivated within ourselves and by ourselves. And a major reason why many of us end up feeling like we don't belong here is because we are trained all our lives to be stimulated and externally motivated, only to one day find that we aren't satisfied with our external motivation, or that our external motivations are gone, leaving us helpless and unable to motivate ourselves. To avoid or escape this fate, we must cultivate our own drive, which is to say, we prove to be our own source of motivation, determined yet free. We need to not just long for, but be longing, which is to say, we are a desire and drive, and we are such for a long time, say, all our lives. Without intrinsic motivation, it might be impossible to belong again. Today and again. But again, if traditional belonging was in a sense artificial, then perhaps intrinsic motivation is the only actual belonging. Furthermore, this book will argue that what makes possible actual belonging is also what makes us avoid the great crisis, the meta crisis, and the like secondarily. First things first. But it starts with us. Now, today, however unlikely or difficult the world might have belonging again, which is to say finally belonging again, with the again slashed out, in the sense that it gains and spreads the conditions of childhood and incubators of intrinsic motivation at scale. And the again is a play, as Dr. Philippe Nicholas talks about how in Hegel you never really return. The return is always the RE is in parentheses, because when you return somewhere, it's different. It's never the same. So returning always has a certain excess in it. So belonging again is not really, the again has an excess. And Dr. Philippe Nicholas is a tremendous Hegel scholar, and I suggest his work. And he did studies under Dr. Holgate, who is incredible. And they have recordings of Holgate's lectures. For most of history, we found roots in soil, and this was an important historic episode alluding to Hegel. But now we must find roots in drive, which might entail a commitment to a particular soil, but not necessarily. What is primary is that we find roots in an orbit, lack, formulation, and way of life. The path must be a place of surprise, but not chaos, dance. Our challenge now is learning how to be comfortable with tension and existential anxiety. Our challenge now is becoming children. Our challenge now is realizing an opportunity for belonging. That is arguably the first time in history during which belonging is available to us. At the end of true history, with the true in parentheses, where absolute history is possible, as we will discuss and explore. To belong again, with the again in parentheses, could be the first time. Absolute. We belong. In Abyssal Arrows, the philosophy portal anthology on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Cadell last wrote, Zarathustra already knew, or at least anticipated, that this was the situation before he started his speeches at the Last Supper on the Overman. But in confronting the reality of it, there is a brief sense of disappointment or defeat. In other words, we get the sense that while he is now capable of leading, the actual task of founding a community that leads to a world of overmen is something which must still wait. And thank you for coming by, John. I appreciate it. Part 1 made the case that we are still waiting, but the stakes are rising, that we need to address the task with which Nietzsche left us. As encouraged by Philip Reef, we underwent an explanation of the psycho-historical process in Part 1, to be positioned for an address of a psychopolitical economy in Part 2. And here we will argue that there is always a human and contingent element, meaning the development of the subject is central. Part 1 left us with considerations of absolute knowers, children, and delusian individuals. And the book also suggested that, if we mean something traditional by the phrase belonging again, is not possible or desirable without risking grave regression or consequence. In Part 2, we seek to address this loss of possibility. And by belonging again, we might consider something more like belonging again, in parentheses, which is a Hegelian negation sublation, suggesting that ours is an age in which we might belong for the first time, finally, to channel Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot. Nietzsche never wanted followers, Cadell stresses, but rather children. Might that be us? Must it be? If so, we must learn to leave Plato's cave on our own. A founding story must be reconsidered, a genesis of a genesis. And that brings us to the close of the introduction of Belonging Again II.1, which you can find on Amazon, and you can find discussions about it on the playlist on YouTube. I appreciate your time today and for being here. And for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And I hope everyone checks out the Theory Underground conversation with Dr. Studebaker. That will be starting in 15 minutes. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming by, and all the best.